we have reached our last panel. The last panel will discuss the nuclear option in armed conflicts, and it will be moderated by Csaba Molditz, head of the School of International Studies at MCC.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this last panel. This is maybe the most interesting, I would say. Yeah, because this is definitely hardcore questions that we are going to discuss today. So I'd like to start with a quote. And that sounds the following way. Your eyes can deceive you. Don't trust them. Obi-Wan Kenobi from the Star Wars, one of the greatest thinkers of all time and all galaxies, I would say. So what we can see today, there's a kind of fog, we are in it, and there's also the possibility of probably a nuclear war. So this is the question that concerns all of us. What do you think of that? I know this is big questions, maybe too big, but this is maybe the most important one. Who would like to start? Maybe Omar? Go ahead.
Thank you very much, and I don't know if I should thank you for giving me that question or not. It's extremely difficult to predict. I mean, the Clausewitz has the famous saying, once the war starts, surprises starts. No one expected this war to go that way from the very beginning. I remember the the head of the chiefs of staff in the U.S. Army, General Mike Miley, was saying that Kyiv is going to fall in 96 hours, or was quoted as such in the media. The Ukrainians did not expect the war to come to Kyiv. They expected it in the east. Many were saying this is not, the escalation will never reach that level. And then pretty much the phases of the war, from the withdrawal in April 2022 of the Russian forces from 4 oblasts, and then the continuation of that, were all in a way unexpected. So the million-dollar questions is it going to escalate to the highest level of warfare, which is nuclear warfare? On one end, you have the doctrine, the Russian doctrine, which basically tells you that the nuclear warfare should be conducted once two conditions are met. One is the retaliation to a nuclear strike, and 2 is the existential threat for the Russian Federation. Now, there was updates to that doctrine. That's the 2014 doctrine. Mm-hmm. There was updates to that doctrine in 2020, if I remember correctly, and it added 2 other conditions, which are about the one, if there is a preemptive strike, mm-hmm. That Russia is going to lose a conventional situation, and there's a preemptive strike to that. And 2, if there was a cyber attack on the command and control structures of the Russian Federations, and therefore it will prevent it from using nuclear weapons. So two preemptive strike, one cyber, one conventional. I am 100% sure that it's a political decision. It's not a military decision. The military, what it usually does is it gives options to the political leadership. And I am 100% sure that the political leadership will not look at the doctrine. Mm. It will interpret whatever it wants to interpret, and then after that, the doctrine needs to be ratified as such. There is no nuclear threat to Russia, so the first phase, retaliation, is out. Mm. The second phase of existential, and I think we had that debate. I think one of our colleagues here, Zoltan, was mentioning that on Twitter the other day, that the existential is basically a perception. But I would a bit disagree with that, because Crimea is not an existential threat of Russia. The Russian Federation signed at least 4 times that the Crimean Peninsula is part of Ukraine. Once, 3 times in December 1991, 4th of December, in Brest, Belarus, and then in Almaty, in Kazakhstan, and then after that in Minsk, Belarus. So 3 times in December 1991. 4th time here in Budapest for the security assurances in the Budapest Memorandum, saying specifically that not just the respect of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but that it will provide security assurances and protection for Ukraine in case of a threat to its territorial integrity. So, well, back then, Crimea was not an existential issue for Russia because it actually signed on that. Now that changed in 2014 for one reason, so big question mark there. So, it can be interpreted as an existential threat if the leadership chooses so, or it can be, we have a whole list in our series of reflexive control, threatening and fear to get the desired reaction. Madman theory, you know, look, I'm hysteric, my finger is on the nuclear button. There is no finger and there's no nuclear button. Just to, I can explain the technical details of how to reach a nuclear strike. It does not include pressing a button somewhere in an office. There is basically issues of, well, the so-called escalate to de-escalate, although I disagree with the whole framing, but it is there. So there's a whole theories of, yes, you can use it when you want to do so, which leaves us a bit in a sort of destructive ambiguity situation. Yeah.
So you are saying basically that we are living in a much more dangerous world than we ever lived.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay, who would like it? Please, George.
Briefly, I think we are in a very serious danger of an escalation that would end ultimately in nuclear use. And I'll make a couple of points to illustrate why I believe that's true. First of all, when it comes to Crimea, I think it's absolutely correct that at certain periods in the past several decades, the Russians have not treated Crimea and control of Crimea as an existential imperative for Russia. But I think that point illustrates why we're in such a dangerous period right now. Red lines, those issues that states are willing to go to war to defend, are not always static. They're not always fixed. They change with circumstances. They change with international circumstances. They change with domestic political circumstances. And in Crimea, it's one thing for the Ukrainian state to control Crimean territory and provide Russia access for its Black Sea fleet, which is home-based on Crimea. That is an important security imperative for Russia because, of course, the Black Sea fleet defends against potential naval assaults on Russia's southern periphery. Russia has never been willing to give up the Black Sea fleet. And as long as they were assured that Ukraine, A, was not a hostile Western military outpost, and B, they could still maintain access to port facilities there, I think they were content with that situation. That changed. They became concerned, A, that Ukraine was transforming into a hostile military outpost of the United States in one form or another. And potentially, they were looking at a situation where Sevastopol would not be a Russian naval port, but a NATO naval port. And that's a much different set of circumstances for the Russians. That gets into very serious security threats as they perceive them to Russia's southern periphery. The second point I'll make is, and you'll indulge me for a minute because I'm going to get into a little bit of international relations theory, but Robert Jervis wrote a quite noteworthy book years ago called Perception and Misperception in International Relations. And he distinguishes between deterrence model problems, where you're dealing with an aggressive state that is bent on expansionism, bent on aggression, and will only stop when it meets staunch military power in return. The classic example being Nazi Germany. And he contrasts that model with what he calls the spiral model, in which a state that has defensive fears perceives actions by potential adversaries, which the adversaries themselves think are defensive, as potential threats. And you get into an action-reaction cycle that escalates, that spirals into a confrontation, in which both sides think they're actually taking defensive measures. Now, the problem that I think we face in Ukraine, at the risk of oversimplification, is that each side believes that this is a deterrence model problem. The Russians think they're taking defensive actions against NATO and the West encroaching on areas that the Russians find quite sensitive from a security point of view. And we in the West, and obviously Ukraine, believes that we're taking defensive measures to prevent Russian aggression. But in fact, I think what's going on is we are in an escalatory spiral of action and reaction, and that spiral did not start on February 24th, 2022. It goes back many years prior to that. And each state has been taking steps which actually escalate. And that escalation has not ended. We're still in that escalatory spiral. We're seeing it playing out in Ukraine today. And you don't break out of an escalatory spiral through the kinds of measures you take in a deterrence problem. Measures that work in a deterrence situation actually exacerbate your escalatory problem when you're in a spiral. That's what's going on right now. The only way you get out of a spiral is through diplomacy. The one thing that the deterrence model says you should not do, because it actually encourages aggression. It's appeasement. So we have a mismatch between the steps that we think will bring stability and what is actually going to be effective in mitigating and ultimately ending the escalatory spiral we're in. That spiral, if we don't arrest it sometime soon, logically will continue to the point where nuclear use becomes quite conceivable. So I think we do have a very serious problem here.
Okay, thank you very much. So you're not only in a fog, which is changing and more dangerous, but it looks like a downward spiral, right? Unless there is a diplomacy. Yeah? Max, what do you think about that?
I agree with a lot of that. I would like to see more thinking along the lines of the spiral model over the deterrence model. The deterrence model is dominant in Washington, D.C. Any talk about negotiation is seen as appeasement. I do believe in the logic, essentially, of defensive realism, where a lot of actions taken for self-defense are misperceived by the other side as offensive-minded, which contributes to mutual escalation. I want to back up and just say I'm very happy that we're having, a panel on the nuclear possibility. Frankly, I think there should be more discussion of it in the Western media. When we talk about, so even though I'm very happy that we're talking about nukes, and I think that it's a very real problem that we definitely need to take into consideration, that doesn't mean that I estimate a high likelihood of nuclear use. But when we talk about risk is really a function not only of the likelihood of an event happening, but also the severity of an event conditional on it happening. And given, the magnitude of a nuclear event, there needs to be more discussion of it. The warmongering in the West, one of its key assumptions is that Russia essentially will not escalate further. Sometimes it's expressed as saying that Russia cannot reasonably escalate further. I would refer you to Representative Mike McCall, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who basically says we shouldn't even consider the possibility that our actions might lead to Russian escalation. Not to be confused with Mike McFaul, the former US ambassador to Russia, professor at Stanford, who's been a very vocal proponent of the war. He says that, quote, he's confident that Putin will not use a nuclear weapon because he's not suicidal. That's what McFaul says. I don't share this level of confidence. for all sorts of reasons. I know I have a limited amount of time here. But even if we're dealing with rational actors, even if we assume Putin's rational and Biden's rational and everyone's rational and nobody wants nuclear war, returning to IR theory, that doesn't rule out the possibility of nuclear conflict. You know, we need to take seriously the possibility of misperceptions, of miscalculations. Those who are familiar with the history of the Cold War knew that in some cases we actually came kind of close to nuclear events happening, like in 1956 during the Suez, even though all parties involved did not want there to be a nuclear war. It was essentially based on misperceptions. And when you have a crisis, as we're experiencing now, the odds of that kind of miscalculation grow. The empirical record on nuclear usage is fortunately very limited. It's restricted to the American use, of course, against Japan in those two attacks. However, there is a literature in political science where there is a stronger empirical basis, and that's called the civilian victimization literature. And what that looks at statistically is it tries to determine basically the determinants of whether national militaries will essentially go ballistic by using indiscriminate violence against the population. And I find that literature to be useful in an inferential way to getting at the likelihood of a nuclear attack, because there are some similarities, because, of course, a nuclear attack also could well involve indiscriminate violence as well. And what the scholars, people like Alex Downs at GW, have found is that the number one determinant of civilian victimization is when one side starts to feel desperate. And that desperation is proxied in a very specific way in terms of the number of people killed on that side. In this case, the number of Russians killed or wounded, right? And we don't have exact numbers on that, but it's in the few hundreds of thousands if we include wounded. So there is some kind of desperation there, as well as how long in duration the conflict lasts. And so this is a very costly war of attrition that Russia is involved with. Militarily, in many ways, it's going to have trouble keeping pace with the constant flow of NATO weapons going in. Nuclear weapons might be seen as sort of a great equalizer in a very costly conflict where conventionally Russia is being tested. And so in that sense, in that scientific sense, there is an increased sense of desperation on the Russian side. You do hear rhetorical threats coming out of Russia, not just from Putin, but more explicitly from Medvedev, basically saying that you can't take for granted that we're not going to use nuclear weapons. There is also some action behind this rhetoric. There's been an erosion in arms control protocols in terms of participation in START, in terms of delegating nuclear authority to Belarus, right? Meanwhile, there's been an increase in Ukrainian attacks inside Russia, which Putin describes as terrorism, which contributes to, or sort of maybe validates, or at least helps Putin's narrative that this is an existential conflict, that Russians are at risk here. And so all of these factors combined are why I think it's good that we're talking about the possibility of a nuclear attack. I do think that the possibility of a nuclear event is rising, and given the severity of one happening, it should be something that we discuss, even though it's more likely than not that we're not going to have a nuclear event, if you will.
Okay, thank you very much. So again, going back to this fog, so more dangerous, changing, looks like a downward spiral. It's a little bit more generated in the West, yeah? So artificially generated, this situation. What do you think, Professor?
Well, thank you, first of all, for organizing the conference and this interesting panel. Well, I think while I agree with most of the argument made in the panel, I should say that I generally disagree in the sense that there is a major risk of use of nuclear weapon in this conflict. And the reason is that, you know, from the very beginning of the war, I think we had nuclear deterrence in the background of the conflict working properly. Why I'm saying that? Because if just we go back to the concept of nuclear deterrence, the concept, while quite complex, it's also very simple. The definition of deterrence, at least in this case, means that you can pose a credible threat and you can make your adversary believe that you're going to use that threat, not just because you're going to use it, but because you want to change the calculus, and it's basically the strategic calculus of your threat, of your enemy. The cost will rise if well, the deterrence works. That's the logic of deterrence. So why I'm saying that? Because if we see that Russians signaling, strategic signaling from the beginning of the war, well, we see that at the end of February, just a few days after the war, Russian president announced increase of the high alert of the nuclear armed forces. But however, in the actual posture, I mean, Russian nuclear posture, we don't see any major changes. I mean, when you go and see, at least as far as we know, on the open source intelligence, there are not really major change in the nuclear posture of Russia. Despite all the strategic signalings, you know, we had these shellings of a nuclear power plant in Ukraine. We had, as said Max, we had the Russian suspension of its obligation under New START treaty. We had actually the news of the deployment of Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, which is still should be seen if that is going to take place and what is actually that means. So the deterrence, I'm saying working because of two facts, because of the objective that Russians were following. I think Russian objectives were two things. First, they attempted to draw the red lines to the NATO. Actually, the major objective of Russians was trying to signal that a major direct involvement of NATO will lead to that point that no one wants to arrive there. And that's why we see that over a year after the war, well, first, the scope of the war remained contained. So we are just seeing a war happening in a very particular areas. It's not necessarily because of Russian weakness. Well, that's part of the story, but that another part of the story is that the way that the West intervened was very much influenced by the nuclear threat. And the second objective is basically what you do in a nuclear deterrence, which you mentioned at the beginning, and it's the concept of ambiguity. It means that you try to manipulate by some sort of intimidating strategy the decision-making process of your adversary. And here in this case, NATO. If you see how in the West the discussion over the delivery of the conventional armed forces, arms to security assistance to Ukraine was very much accompanied by the fear of escalation. So maybe theoretically there are a lot of challenges in this escalation ladder concept, but I think that is very much how Russians are looking at that. They are trying to draw the lines, define the red lines, and then signaling easily that, look, going to certain areas may result to a major escalation. And that's actually has worked. We see that it delayed or it made a kind of a step-by-step NATO intervention or security assistance in Ukraine, which basically helped Russia to advance, to keep its position. And it kept the territory of the conflict actually confined. So one may argue here the problem is this, that while I don't, as I said, I don't see a major actual possibility of use of nuclear forces in this case, but the problem is that a nuclear doctrine is working. So Russians are seeing it working, Americans are seeing it working, and the rest of the world are seeing it working. And that's why you have, It's a continuation of a trend that we had before the war in Ukraine. You know, China by 2030 is going to have 1,500 nuclear warheads. You have North Korea that is building up its own arsenal. You have Russian and US modernization of its nuclear forces. You have Iran that is hedging toward nuclear ambiguity strategy. So basically what is happening is that many states are concluding that nuclear deterrence is a useful mechanism to complement your deterrence model. And here the problem starts. The second problem. Actually, the second problem is what was said. A non-proliferation mechanism is under stress. Basically, when states start to conclude that nuclear deterrence works, basically you have the problem with non-proliferation treaties. Non-proliferation treaties will not work anymore like before because basically there are more actors that see interest to proliferate. So we are facing, I'm not so much feared of the short-term threat of a nuclear use. What seems to be more strategic long-term threat is the gradual growth of reliance, of a global reliance in defense strategy and defense doctrine on nuclear dimension. And that means proliferation. And finally, what is again worrying is that, you know, against the pattern that we had during the Cold War, which you see the strategic dialogue with the United States and Russia taking place under a very tense political environment. You know, the superpowers were able to have issues compartmentalized. Now, as Jake Sullivan in his last week comment correctly mentioned, you have this concept under stress. Basically means that what Russians did was breaking this pattern and bringing nuclear diplomacy as part of a broader political dispute that they have with the United States. And basically here is where, again, we have, as mentioned, the problem of perception, misperception, but still we have proper confidence building measures, still some of them working in place when it comes to nuclear, technical nuclear issues between the United States and Russia. But in general, the nuclear diplomacy, we said proliferation is rising, but nuclear diplomacy is declining because of its very direct connection with, against the experience of a Cold War, because of a very direct connection with the political situation between the United States and Russia.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have partly touched upon the topic of responsibility. And we all know from Franklin D. Roosevelt that great power involves great responsibility. What do you think about that? So especially speaking of the United States, Russia, and maybe even China. Omar, would you like to start?
In terms of de-escalating?
Yeah, exactly.
So I'll start from what was mentioned on actually deterrence is working, and it is working on a certain level because we almost now over 15 months of the war. The NATO is not in Ukraine, so the 200,000 casualties that Max mentioned, pretty much Ukrainians done that. That level of death, wounded, POWs and missing, that's not NATO. And Russia did not use nukes so far. It's a conventional war. In terms of the I think there was also mutual threats multiple times. It did not work in the beginning because we know that William Burns was in Moscow before the invasion, and he mentioned, "Do not invade. We know exactly what we're doing. We will inform." And there was a whole media strategy before that. So that's in terms of trying to stop the invasion before it happens. That one didn't work, but overall the escalation to the highest level of warfare did work. I think it will need more and more dialogue among the nuclear powers of the world to try to further de-escalate. But at this particular moment, I don't know if that's possible. There is a very strong belief that on the one end, Russia can conventionally win, and on the other end, in Kyiv, there's a strong belief of the lands were taken in 2014. We ignored, in the first attempt in Crimea, if, I don't know if all of you remember, there were pressures on Ukraine, don't fight back. If you fight back, you'll get massacred. That was the Obama administration with the Merkel administration together. And we know who exactly was lobbying on behalf of the Kremlin in the Merkel administrations. We know the name of the politicians. And Ukraine said, okay, well, we'll get it back. They were told, we'll get it back with diplomacy and sanctions. By the summer, by April actually, they realized that, oh, we're not going to lose Crimea only, but also the Donbas is a threat because so by the summer, there was the first Ukrainian counteroffensive, and that was ignoring the allies. That was ignoring all attempt to de-escalate. And we know the rest of the story, the MH17, the airlines that were downed by the separatists using a official book, SA-11 system, a very sophisticated system that shot down a civilian airliner, killed many Europeans, almost 300, and so on. So things kept on escalating since then until the full-scale invasion, which was also, once again, ignoring the allies, because there were European leaders that were saying to Mr. Zelensky, surrender. And they were also putting on the nuclear argument. So I think it will need a multilateral effort to both Moscow and Kyiv. I'm not sure if that multi-effort will be successful in de-escalating on the conventional, but at least keeping the nuclear out of the equation.
Thank you very much. Max, please.
Yeah, I think, there have been a number of peace proposals that have come out of, the BRICS countries. We've seen China, we've seen Brazil. I would expect to see more, peace proposals, but I'm not optimistic about them at all. What I call, sort of the Western war hawks, which would certainly include the Biden administration, not only do they downplay the potential risks of escalation, including nuclear conflict, but in a way they kind of like this war. It's seen as a relatively low cost by the United States, given the size of its economy, to inflict massive damage against the Russians. And sure, there's a lot of bloodshed, but it's not American bloodshed. Most of these war hawks, I think they have a very simplistic view of international relations, where they look at US relations with Russia in zero-sum terms. They think the United States, that Russia is the adversary, and to the extent that we could inflict costs on Russia and make it more insecure, that therefore America becomes more secure. And so there's a strong thrust to minimize the risks and to keep bloodying Russia, which supposedly makes the United States safer. Again, returning to the civilian victimization literature, that literature would indicate the exact opposite, right? Where we see that the more desperate a side becomes, the greater its losses, the more it's like a protracted war of attrition, the greater the likelihood that that side is going to escalate and lash out with indiscriminate violence. And so I'm not that optimistic about these various, peace processes being floated, because the leader on the Western side sees utility in this conflict. Also, it's really hard to find what political scientists would call, a bargaining space when you look at the positions of Ukraine and Russia. Zelensky's, official position is that he's not prepared to cede even an inch of Ukraine, pre-2014 Ukraine. And Russia doesn't seem eager at all to cede the areas where it's in, especially in Crimea. Meanwhile, there is continued flirtation of Ukraine joining NATO. So the head of NATO says, he foresees Ukraine joining. There are constant statements by high-level Western elites saying that they see the future of NATO with Ukraine. So in practical terms, I don't see where a bargain would lead, and I think that the incentives against negotiation, certainly on the US side, are against it. So I guess I'm a pessimist overall. I'm so sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. George, the floor is yours.
Well, I think your question is, do the nuclear superpowers have a responsibility not just to themselves but to the war in mitigating the likelihood of nuclear use? And I think the answer is absolutely yes, they do. It is a legal imperative, of course. One of the premises of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is that the existing nuclear powers have an obligation to pursue nuclear arms control and ultimately nuclear disarmament. And to the degree that they fail to do that, they are not upholding their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But it's not just a legal and political imperative, it's a moral imperative, because the fate of the rest of the world to some significant degree hangs in the balance here. I don't think that deterrence is working, and I'm using that term broadly as opposed to nuclear deterrence, because obviously we haven't seen nuclear use yet, and part of the reason for that is because of the grave implications that that would hold for all parties, not just the one that was initiating nuclear use. I don't think Putin wants to use nuclear weapons. In fact, I think his war strategy is designed to achieve victory without having to resort to them. He recognizes that the West has significant technological superiority over Russia when it comes to conventional munitions. And so he's not trying to get into a fight matching technology against technology. He's trying to take advantage of Russia's relative advantages, which are scale, manpower, land, the ability to churn out large numbers of relatively low-cost weapons that can, over time, simply exhaust Ukraine's ability to continue to field an army and supply it. And I think Putin thinks it's working overall. But there are two potential vulnerabilities in this strategy. One is if the West and Ukraine are able to turn this back into a war of maneuver in which they take advantage of precision-guided munitions, real-time 24/7 intelligence, identify Russian weaknesses on the battlefield and exploit them quickly. Should that happen, and by implication Russia's attrition strategies start to fail, then I think you're in a situation where Putin might have no choice other than to escalate this war in some significant way. And I don't think that escalation would begin with the use of nuclear weapons, but it could well end there once you get into a cycle of action and reaction that leaves one side with no choice. And that, I think, is a real danger here. So how do we get out of this situation? During the Cold War, there was a mutual recognition, at least for the bulk of that period, that the Soviet Union and the United States were essentially chained together as mutual hostages, that one side's security could not be assured unless the other side had some level of security that was also assured. In other words, the notion that the United States could be secure when the Soviet Union was absolutely insecure was recognized as a falsehood. We've lost that recognition today. I think Max has accurately pointed out that the United States believes that decreasing Russia's security actually enhances our own. And that's only true to a point. I think you can reach a level, and I think we're close to it, where enhancing Russia's fears, its insecurity, is going to endanger the West and the world. So we have to understand that there are lines that we should not cross, that are extremely dangerous to cross. Now, what's happening in Washington right now is a very interesting article in the Washington Post last week talking about red lines. And the point of this article was that America, Tony Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, are growing more confident that Russia's red lines are not as firmly drawn as we had thought early in the war. Why? Because we've continually moved further and further, and the Russians have not retaliated directly against the West. So Washington's growing more confident that we've got more room to escalate. We can provide not just shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles, but Patriot anti-air batteries. not just shoulder-fired javelin anti-tank weapons, but M1 Abrams tanks. And you know what? The Russians aren't going to do anything about it. They're not going to retaliate. So we can push further. That kind of logic is premised on the belief that, that Russia's red lines are fixed, and we can walk right up to them but not cross them. But what happens if those lines aren't fixed? What happens if they move according to circumstances? What happens if a red line that's okay while Russia thinks it's winning a war of attrition suddenly becomes intolerable under circumstances in which Russia thinks it might actually lose the war? Its lines might collapse. I think we're playing a very dangerous game. And we're growing more confident that we can do a lot more against Russia in a period where I think the chances of Russian retaliation against the West directly might start to increase if their fortunes on the battlefield start to erode. So I do think we're in a moment of great danger.
Yes, because basically the red lines can quickly change from one.
I think that's right.
Please, Abdullah.
Look, I think it's very difficult to define the concept of responsibility while we're doing, I mean, any framing of responsibility through a moral perspective, while we are engaging in a strategic calculus and realistic strategic calculus of states. What I mean by that is that I think both sides have a good, good sense of a strategic culture of not going beyond their own interests. So responsibility in this context of the war is defined based on the strategic interests of each of these states, which basically here United States and Russia. And that, as we are seeing in this context of the war, I think is very much defined by resources. We are in a war over resources. And the battle is over resources, as we said, attrition warfare. But, in this concept of warfare, I mean, it's natural that looking from the eyes of the United States, there's always this tendency of linking it immediately to the nuclear case. But getting a bit outside this US-dominated perspective, you may realize, we may see many wars that were run by this constant, complex dynamic between resources, war over resources. I give you an example, like Iran and Iraq war last 8 years. And it's true that none of them were nuclear-capable states, but the option of nuclear usage here still continues that logic of mass destruction moment. So basically, as I said in the beginning of my speech, it's very much linked for two options: to not use it and define the red lines and scope control. So nuclear warfare is not something for the real world, because everyone will die out of it. And by the way, Russia, even if technically, technologically inferior than the United States, in the nuclear warfare can cause that mass destruction to the United States. So basically, it's a more complex picture, I think. At some points, we need to get out of this nuclear dimension from the war, to look at it from a possibility of attrition warfare, which you're talking about to Russia has a huge industrial base. It shows that numbers matter. It is stressing the missile defenses through different strategies of using drones, fake missiles and decoys and whatever. So still the concept of relying on the war of attrition, I think, is very much what Russians are looking at that. And they are strategically wise enough to not go, because there are this intention that, look, sometimes we try to make the adversary as an actor that might make big miscalculations. Well, Russia did miscalculation when they went into Ukraine, but I think the strategic culture when it comes to nuclear case in Russia is strong enough, and the nuclear command structure in Russia is strong enough and logically advanced enough to not enter to the phase of escalation in nuclear terms. So I see it very much a continuation, the responsibility to be short, responsibility as a continuation from the view of Moscow and Washington, the continuation of a conventional war.
Okay, thank you. George, please.
Just a quick comment. I think the Iran-Iraq war analogy is quite an interesting one, because that was a war that the Iranians wanted to win on the basis of attrition. They had superior manpower. That was their advantage on the battlefield, and it was working. And interestingly enough, on the Iraqi side, they used weapons of mass destruction. They didn't have nuclear weapons, they had chemical weapons. And that was the equalizer. That was what enabled the Iraqis to overcome Iran's manpower superiority. We had a situation where one of the sides couldn't effectively fight a war of attrition, and they changed the way the war was being fought through the use of weapons of mass destruction. And I think that same dynamic can occur here, and we've got to be careful. If the Russians aren't able to win a war of attrition because we won't let them do that, then the chances of escalation go up quite significantly, and that's the danger that we're in.
Just a very quick comment.
Just quickly on that, and then a couple of quick points. Iran had no allies at all. Iran could not get the masks to protect itself from the chemical weapons. Nobody gave them, you know. Later on, the Chinese provided some weapons, so they had no nuclear allies to defend them on that side. And from the beginning, we can talk about the Iraq-Iran war for a long time, but from the beginning, the Iraqi attack was doomed. It tried to mimic Israel in the Six-Day War. It failed to hit. Israel put all 18 Egyptian airports out of action in the first probably few hours of the attack. The Iraqi, in the whole days, the Iraqi Air Force could not put one airport, Iranian airport, out of action in the whole day. So it was a completely different failed conventional. It was called like the lame blitzkrieg in military literature. But anyway, that aside, the two quick issues on the responsibility. Budapest memorandum for security assurances for Ukraine in exchange of handing its 1,200 nuclear warheads. It's including about 200 tacticals, so about 200 short range, less than 8 kilotons warheads, including the delivery system, which is about 20 strategic bombers, was signed by the UK, the US, Russia, Russian Federation, but also had France and China. So all the nuclear powers were really, or the majority of the nuclear powers were really involved in it. So there's a responsibility there. It did not work out, as we saw in February and March 2014. So that's one. The other point has to do also with, that's also a macro point, the international system where the nuclear power loses the conventional war. Well, launches first the war of aggression to take parts of another country, loses the conventional war by the smallest side, the weakest side, and then rattles the nuclear sword. So that system, this is like a nuclear brinkmanship, and if it dominates the international system, there is no system. Basically, whoever gets the nuclear weapon first, it will be a nuclear race, basically, because everybody would want to defend his land. Now, the positive meso-level, dyadic level point is that all nuclear countries, all 8 of them, lost wars. All of them lost conventional wars. The 9th is Israel, which is ambiguous about its nuclear capabilities, but it's also lost wars. So all of them lost wars, conventional ones. Did not have to resort to using nukes. Finally, the issue on, that's the Ukraine stuff, the maneuver. It was a maneuver warfare since 2014. The first counteroffensive in the summer of 2014 that liberated Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, Mariupol, many of the towns that we talk about, it was maneuver. It was the 5th counteroffensive, if I'm counting right, from 2014, and that was last spring, 2022, that brought back Kharkiv. That was a complete collapse of Russian lines, and complete collapse of numbers and of course, degraded, but elite units. The 1st Guards Tank Army, that was an elite unit. The 11th Corps of Kaliningrad, those collapsed in Kharkiv. Plus the lesser units, the Russian Rosgvardia units, and some of the LNR, the local militias,
those collapsed, and it was you saw it on probably the videos. It was very much maneuver warfare, as opposed to the attrition that was going on in Kherson.
Omar,
So,
sorry to interrupt you. So sad to say, but we are running out of time, so we have to go to the questions and answers, and we do have some questions. So before citing the first one, it reminded me of again a quote from an American comedian who once said that marriage is a great institution, but who wants to live in an institution, and then now these powers seem to behave like this guy think that we don't like this institution. So looking forward a little bit, what do you think of the period after the war? So what kind of institution we have to redraft or redesign in order to keep peace? Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question. Let me build up, based on what Omar mentioned, a very important issue of Budapest, actually memorandum, and failure of international norms to keep security guarantees. You know, that basically, what was the problem of Ukraine was its reliance over extended deterrence. So basically, I mean, we can argue about extended deterrence of the United States here because there was no sort of official pledge to Ukraine by the United States to have that type of deterrence. But anyway, believing on the rightness and the delivery of international system to secure the nations, that's something that has actually shattered by the war. So that has a huge consequences because that basically means that the states can only engage into non-proliferation, disarmament, or any international agreement when it's backed by powerful indigenous deterrence model. So if you fail to build up your own deterrence, you're always in the risk of being attacked by one superpower that no one can interact. You know, this time is Russia, but we see, as discussed in panels before, that it was before the United States that made other wars, and when you're faced with the great power attack, basically, you cannot do anything meaningful in response. And there's one big case, again, back to the case of Iran, because of these days it's a hot topic. You know, look at the JCPOA, which is important for controlling, for managing Iran's nuclear program, which is an important arms control treaty. And United States, the Trump administration withdrawal from that was another case, actually, before the war in Ukraine that showed that you cannot rely on international agreements. Basically, you cannot rely on any systemic mechanisms at international level to provide or guarantee your security. That is a huge problem for next stage of building on international norms.
Okay, thank you. Let's go back a little bit to the war in Ukraine. There is another question. It's a very simple one, actually, but provocative. Is it, sorry, one question and one answer. So is it possible that the West will give Ukraine nuclear weapons?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Is it possible that the West will give Ukraine nuclear weapons? George?
Extremely unlikely, near zero chance of that happening, for all kinds of obvious reasons. I think the chances that the Ukrainians might use them would be significant. And that's, you know, not in the American interest to see happen.
I get your point. So, next question. Why to stop mutual assured destruction, or how, I guess, and CN Stanford free online course. I don't know the course, but anyway. So how to stop?
How to stop mutual assured destruction? Well, I don't think we should stop it. I think it's an unfortunate reality of the circumstances that we live in the world, and the alternatives are worse. And you know, John Lewis Gaddis, the Cold War historian, in fact, referred to the Cold War as the long peace that, you know, ensued as a result of this concept of mutually assured destruction. What I think has to happen going forward is not necessarily to build new institutions or new norms, new rules. We have to take institutions and norms and understandings that were once in effect and revitalize them. And we have to recognize that the rules, the principles on which the Cold War stability was built are principles that are in tension with one another. And you have to balance these principles through a political process. Take, for example, the Organization for Security and Cooperation on Europe, which grew out of the Helsinki process. Principles that were fundamental to that process are the inadmissibility of changing borders by violent means, the importance of protecting sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the principle of the indivisibility of security, that one state cannot secure its own defenses without taking into account the potential impact on other states. Now, these are all principles, that are in tension. The principle of self-determination, that's in tension with the principle of territorial integrity. You only have to look at the Balkans to realize that, if you apply self-determination on an absolute level, the principle of the inviolability of borders, the inadmissibility of changing them by violent means is not going to survive for very long. So you have to recognize that these are principles that you have to apply a diplomatic process to try to balance things that are in tension. There's no magic solution to all of this. Ultimately, if we're going to achieve stability, we're going to have to be talking to each other and orchestrating acceptable compromises that no one is going to find ideal, that many people will not find just, but nonetheless are the best that we can do under the circumstances to preserve stability.
George, I guess these were excellent concluding remarks. We are running absolutely out of time. So I do have some questions, but thank you very much, guys. It was a great discussion.